Out of the way. It is my great pleasure to introduce Gordon Gamm, who has given considerable thought to what's wrong with libertarianism, perhaps even libertarians. Gordon has something online called the Gordon Gamm Initiative, and it's an interesting set of articles that he has gathered. And with that, Gordon, let me move my camera to where you are. And what's up on the screen is being recorded. And let me just check to see that what's on the screen is as focused as it can be. Yes, it is. So, with that, Gordon is going to be asking a set of questions. He's going to ask people to raise their hands to show which way those questions are being answered, and then he asks that he be allowed to do his presentation, and questions will be answered afterwards. Is that correct?
That's right.
Very good. With that, Gordon Gamm. By the way, Gordon, that's the last round of applause you're getting.
Oh,
The last round of applause you're getting, and that's a lie.
Oh, okay. How many?
Please move the microphone to you. Very good.
How many of you here identify yourselves as libertarians?
Big O or little L?
Small L.
Any kind of libertarian. I see only 3 people that didn't raise. My understanding of libertarianism is that even for libertarians, there are certain things that they're willing to acknowledge that government can do or should do, and that is protecting private property, laws that protect private property, and defense, that we need some kind of defense budget, and infrastructure. Now, I've been told by someone that I was speaking to here that there are people that don't even believe in those things that government should be doing. I'm curious, because I'm here to learn from you as well, how many of you think that some of those aspects of government should not be part of government's role? Okay, which of those do you think we can do without? Not a defense or infrastructure or
False dichotomy.
what?
False alternative.
Any of them? We don't need to protect private property. We don't need to have criminal laws. Is that right?
Who's we?
The country. I mean, that our country doesn't
Well,
need it.
I personally may or may not be part of that we for infrastructure.
Uh-huh.
Just because there's no government providing highways doesn't mean they're not going to be highways.
Oh, I understand that. That's what I'm saying. That government, you don't think that it's necessary for government to perform the role of either defense, highways, or infrastructure, or protecting private property. Is that right?
Infrastructure.
Okay. What about defense? Is there anyone that thinks that we would be better off having private enterprise do our defense, like?
How about the militia? Shouldn't they be doing the defense?
Yeah, I'm asking you. I mean, you think that we can get by without having a defense that prepared by the government? Is that right?
No, the militia is the people.
I understand that. It's not, but it's not. Wouldn't be considered part of the government, right?
That's right.
Okay, that's all I'm trying to do is find out where you are on that. And then the next thing I asked you to do was to look at these arguments that I've come up with. They're A through K, and I'd like to get a vote, if you would, look through them. I'll give you a couple of minutes to look through them and vote for which ones you'd like for me to respond to. These are different arguments I've heard from libertarians, and I'll try to, but with a limited amount of time, I'll just take up the ones that you're most interested in. So I'll just give you a few minutes to read those. Does everybody have this handout with the A through
May I make
K?
a recommendation? Why don't you simply ask the question and get a round of voting, and then you pick the one that you want to address.
Okay, here's one. Market capitalism is the greatest engine for economic growth in human history. How many vote for that? Looks like private companies are inherently more efficient than government because there is a profit motive. How many vote for that? Looks like about half as many. Okay.
We might argue with
The rich need tax cuts to be encouraged to spend and create economic growth during times of recession.
And all other times as well.
The gentleman behind you made a comment, and so I think that was a very cogent comment. So let's ask that again. The rich need tax cuts to be encouraged to spend and create economic growth during times of recession, as well as all other times as well.
Yeah, just delete those 4 final words.
Okay, that's fine with me. So how many would respond yes to that? Not just recession, but other times. Not too many, okay. America is a capitalist economy. Who believes that?
Well, it's a mixed economy. You said that in the essay. It's a mixed economy.
Well, that's my response, is that it isn't a capitalist. I mean, I'm going to respond to these flaws, and that would be my response, is that you're right, it is a mixed economy. But if you believe it's a capitalist economy, raise your hand. That's what some libertarians.
Well, it's partially true.
Well, it's either a
Some
mixed
true or
economy, or it's a capitalist economy, or it's a socialist economy. And if you believe it's a capitalist economy, raise your hand. If you think it's something else, then don't raise your hand. I mean, that's all I'm asking you to do. Okay? Doesn't seem like there's anybody that believes it's a capitalist economy. Adam Smith is the source of revealed authority that established that the markets work perfectly and government can only worsen outcomes. How many vote for that?
If you add one of the sources, yes.
Okay. Free markets are the sublime expression of human liberty. All right. Federal regulation has a negative impact on employment and is particularly hurtful to small businesses. People with experience as successful business people recognize that government is an impediment to innovation, job creation, and business expansion.
Yes.
I'm going to skip down to K. Liberals want to take money from those who earn their money from work or venture capital and give it to people that don't want to work, pretend to work, or don't have initiative to start a business. There are plenty of jobs for people who want to work and programs to train people for the skills necessary in the workforce. How many agree with that? I'm surprised more people didn't say yes to that. Okay.
It's a pretty extensive question.
Yeah. Pretty broad.
Okay, well, I was going to begin by responding to some of these arguments, and are there any others that I didn't include, or that I could?
Yes.
Yes. What would that be?
It's not a lot of talk about morality. I would say, thou shalt not steal.
That you think that libertarians have
Libertarianism is
are
morally proper.
morally proper because they don't take from others? Is that?
The taxes are theft.
Yeah, they don't rob Peter to pay Paul.
Gun rights.
There's voluntary action, there's coerced,
Yeah,
Uh-huh.
it's the difference between force and voluntarism. That's it.
Okay, well, let me start off with A. There seem to be a lot of people that said that market capitalism is the greatest engine for economic growth in human history, and I'll give you my response to that. This myth is perhaps the most prevalent in libertarian circles and is easily disproved when you look at the history of economic development in the West and the levels of government intervention in the economy. The stunning growth of the American economy in the 19th century had little to do with unregulated capitalism. As Cambridge economist Professor Ha-Joon Chang notes, America was the most protectionist country in the world until World War II. In fact, as Chang outlines in his book Bad Samaritans, every industrialized economy on the planet grew astronomically by strictly regulating markets, by government investment, and by the protectionism of key industries through nascent stages of development. As former head of the World Bank, Joseph Stiglitz, points out, the countries that adopted free market reforms under IMF structural adjustment policies failed miserably and poverty increased. The underlying theory upon which libertarians base their support for free market capitalism presupposes equal bargaining power between buyer and seller, no serious externalities, no public goods that markets can't properly price. Joan Fitzgerald piece in my report, What the Free Market Can't Do, which I handed out, discusses water, for example. Bankers have more knowledge and power than bank customers. Witness the subprime deception. Corporations have more power than citizens seeking health insurance. Labor markets can't compensate for disparities of power. The condition of ideal market model adequately describes ordinary retail markets where there are plenty of restaurants, supermarkets, choices of soap, and consumers are competent to shop for price and quality. They don't characterize the market in health, education, labor, finance, or technical innovation. The government regulates to counteract market failures. It taxes to provide the revenues to pay for public goods that the market underprovides at affordable prices, such as education, health, research, and development. Government passes laws to protect workers' rights to form unions and prevent discrimination on grounds unrelated to performance of workers, such as race, ethnicity, national origin, sex, age, or sexual orientation. Government can invest things that markets never would have imagined. Apple, for example, piggybacked on government investment in advanced semiconductors and the internet. America's biotech industry success was reliant on successive government investment in the Human Genome Project and other basic research. Commercial broadcasters were disinvesting in radio as a serious medium of news, public affairs, culture, and humor, before public radio, partly underwritten by the government, NPR, demonstrated that ingenious and high-quality, non-commercial programming could attract an audience that for-profit companies did not know was there. Finally, the market itself is a creature of government. Laissez-faire was planned. Without states defining the terms of property, ownership, and commerce, creating money, enforcing contracts, protecting patents and trademarks, and providing basic public institutions, in fact, the capitalist system is impossible without government. Thus, the practical question is,
Anybody want to respond to any of that?
Oh, all of it.
We're going to start with the gentleman behind you who is.
I wasn't through with my
Oh,
presentation.
I'm sorry. I thought you were.
No.
My apologies.
No,
Continue.
that was my response to just one question that you asked me, and that is, the question was, free market capitalism is the greatest engine of economic growth in human history, and I've shared with you much of what I received from Hashu Chang, a economist. Let's see, we got a really good response to free markets are sublime expression of human liberty. So I'll give you my response to that.
It's
Okay. Free markets are a sublime expression of human liberty. In the idealized libertarian world, individuals are free to choose. Never mind that some are born with far more resources with which to choose than others. In the Frederick Hayek, Milton Friedman world, government, except for the minimal role of keeping the peace and protecting property values, is the enemy of freedom. Beyond assuming away inherited disparities, the Hayek-Friedman equation of markets and freedom leave out the role of government in promoting affirmative liberties. A young person from a poor family who does not need to incur crippling debt to attend university is a free person. A low-income mother who cannot afford to pay the doctor attains a new degree of freedom when she and her children are covered by Medicaid. A worker who might be compelled to choose between his job and his physical safety becomes freer if government health and safety regulations are enforced. The employee of a big box store who can take paid family leave when a child gets sick is freer than one whose entire life is at the whim of the boss. Likewise, a worker with a union contract that provides protection from arbitrary dismissal or theft of wages. An elderly person saved from destitution by government-organized Social Security pension has a lot more liberty than one begging groceries at age 80 to make ends meet, or one choosing between supper and filling a prescription. As aspiring homeowner who doesn't need to spend countless hours making sure that the mortgage won't explode is freer to spend leisure time on other activities if government is certifying which financial products are sound and is prohibiting other kinds. Let's see, I know you're eager to interject, so I was going to move on. Let's see. Well, I got a lot of response to federal regulations have a negative impact on employment, and it's particularly hurtful to small business.
Yes, the microphone is on.
Okay, this argument indicates an indifference to concern over the value of workplace safety, public health, and the environment. Such an inquiry about jobs should specify particular regulations in question and examine their employment effects in balance with the objectives targeted by the proposed rule. It would weigh the effects on jobs against the consequences to participants in the sector, that is, workers, owners, consumers, to determine the regulation likely overall impacts. This is not the inquiry in which those opponents of regulation choose to engage, whether it is the oil drilling moratorium followed by the BP deepwater drilling disaster in the Gulf of Mexico, an EPA proposal to curb greenhouse gas emissions, the Dodd-Frank Financial Reform Bill responding to the great crash of 2007, the creation of the Consumer Finance Protection Agency or enactment of the Affordable Care Act predicted job killers by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. The job killer argument maintains that it is confirmed empirically, referring repeatedly to a report authored by Nicholas Crane and Mark Crane that is called The Only Comprehensive Estimate of the Impact of Federal Rules on the U.S. Economy. However, the report is not comprehensive. It is focused exclusively on the cost of regulations without any attempt to their benefit or to the jobs created by new regulatory requirements. The Office of Management and Budget conducted a 10-year study that focused that found that in 106 major regulations for which cost and benefit data were available, benefits were 3 to 10 times greater than cost. For every agency considered, benefits exceeded cost. In June of 2014, the OMB reported to Congress that the economic benefit of federal regulations were in the hundreds of millions of dollars over the last decade, while the costs were a mere fraction of that total. Study after study, as Isaac Shapiro and John Irons observed in their critique, show that regulations have little impact or a slightly positive impact on employment. For example, consider the requirement of automobile companies to reduce air pollution that led to widespread use of catalytic converters. Under these mandates, jobs were created in making, installing, and inspecting the converters. Another example would be about banning climate-damaging coolants and refrigerator and requiring seat belts. Furthermore, focusing only on the employment consequences of regulation, ignore the value of increased health and safety and savings to the economy resulting from reduced health services claims. As for the change contribute to employer uncertainty, new rules to eliminate toxic materials, improve safety in the workplace, or write contracts in plain language provide clear standards by which employers can confirm to avoid liability. Okay, I'll just read one more response and then we'll move on to question and answers. So I know you're eager to do that. Okay, I think a lot of you have this idea that the main benefit of libertarianism has to do with personal liberty, and that anything other than libertarianism amounts to stealing or taking from people that don't, and giving it to people that I guess aren't working or whatever. It just a lot of just has to do with taking, and there's no public benefit isn't worth it. So that's kind of what my last response is, and that has to do with a perception that liberals are all about taking money and being paternalistic, I would say, and trying to think that they know better than the people who have the money about how to spend it. That's a very compelling argument. This argument presupposes that people without jobs or with low income lack ambition or are at fault for their poverty. It presupposes that without regulations, that natural market forces will make jobs available with a living wage. However, regulations became necessary in order to ensure labor standards governing the length of working hours, safety at work, or job security. Most workers who are willingly take bad jobs do so because the alternative is starvation. They may be high unemployment. They may be high unemployed, and they cannot find any other job. Perhaps they are not attractive to any other employer because they are physically stunted, illiterate due to childhood deprivation. Perhaps they are immigrants from rural areas who have lost everything in a flood and thus are desperate for any work, but they have no choices under the circumstances. What makes people poor in poor countries or states is their low productivity, which is rarely their fault. Whereas the mistaken stereotype is a belief that property is the result of laziness. Poverty, that is the result of laziness. What is the most important in determining national productivity is capital equipment, technologies, infrastructure, and institutions that a country or state has, which are not things that the poor can provide. Libertarianism begins with an assumption that all humans are by nature selfish and primarily concerned with their economic self-interest. It ignores other aspects of our personality, such as self-sacrifice, compassion, generosity to strangers, and sacrifice in battle. It ignores the fact that we are naturally social animals whose health is improved by our social connection, whereas loners and people who are isolated from have a lower average life expectancy. It is our trust in one another that enables an economy to succeed and endure. If we were constantly concerned whether we could trust our employees, fellow workers, or our institutions to prevent cheating, then our society would collapse. Good management provides significant autonomy to their employees to contribute their ideas in order to improve performance. The feeling by employees of being trusted and justifying their trust provides worker satisfaction and low, expensive job turnover. For many employees, their job satisfaction based on mutual trust is more important than higher safety. So that comes out of the idea that all people are by nature brutish and selfish, and that if we just leave things alone, that everybody will always be looking over their back for someone trying to cheat them. I mean, that's
You're saying that that's what we believe in.
not telling you.
That's what the left
One second. Let's.
Yeah, that's how it's.
No compassion, no voluntary care.
Whoa! Let's take it easy. Let's
Sorry.
one at a time, and let our guest continue with his presentation.
Libertarian is flawed in that it assumes a one-size-fits-all economic ideology for all situations. Libertarians presume that anything that the government does, that private enterprise can do better. Of teachers, police, firemen, government accountants who take pride in the quality of their work, even as they may make more money in private enterprise. This ignores the research and development done by government that contributed to the knowledge revolution and the success of private businesses in genetics and the internet. The Social Security system is the most efficient insurance company program in the world, in that its cost is minuscule compared to the disbursement of benefits, unlike private insurance companies. My first job as a lawyer was to work for the Legal Aid and Defender Society, representing people that could not afford a lawyer. The quality of lawyers for this agency was excellent. We attracted lawyers from several elite law schools who wanted to use the law to help people who were often victims because of their poor education or inability to have help from experts in the law. We frequently took cases to the U.S. Supreme Court to ensure equal protection under the law. For every one of you who have had a bad experience with government agency employees, do you believe that these behaviors aren't present in private industry? Quality control exists in government, and fairly paid employees like doing their job well for their sense of self-respect, whether or not they are working for private enterprise or government. Government employees often work long hours when they are understaffed and in order to do their job well. Federal employees lose their job regularly for not doing their job well. Look at the number of staff members that have been fired by President Trump. Many of these are people who gain their reputation in private business. They didn't become incompetent within 6 months of becoming a government employee. President Trump himself was elected president because his constituents believed that his private business experience would make him qualified to be president. However, many of the supporters are beginning to question his competence, integrity, and his capacity to evaluate expert opinion. The choice is yours. You can discount the wisdom of qualified government employees in passing laws and regulations that serve the public interest based on their conscience, or you can put your faith in the invisible hand of the market that reflects the way we spend our dollars without regard for the human consequences. If the arts cannot be supported by ticket sales, then government has no role encouraging the arts. If the unemployed cannot support their children in preparing for a productive life because their job doesn't provide a living wage, then it is not a concern of society. If people lose access to health care because they can't afford it, then that is an acceptable libertarian outcome. Some things free market capitalism can do better than the government. Some things the government can do better than private enterprise. Libertarians ignore out-market failures and the value of regulatory oversight of private business practice. They demonize any government involvement as paternalistic or socialism, whether or not it improves the quality of our lives or works more efficiently than free market capitalism. So anyway, I've given you a lot of grist for disagreement.
Okay, what we're going to do is we're going to, I'm going to ask for a show of hands. Right now we have these two gentlemen behind our speaker. Then I have Frank. Who else? Blake.
Why don't you just go around the table in order?
No. Scott. Anybody else wish to speak? Lee? Anybody else? Larry? Because this is going to be long and contentious, please keep your questions short. For the gentleman behind our speaker, please yell, because when I put this up on the on YouTube, I can barely hear you. If I can't hear you, then the rest of the audience cannot hear you. So yell. So we have. You want to do him first? Okay. Loud. Loud.
Have them state their name first, if you don't mind.
No, those two gentlemen do not wish to,
okay. All right.
have their name.
That's fine. All right.
I think a lot of the reaction you're going to get is that you painted many straw man of libertarian views, that many of your characterizations are off the mark. And many folks will also suggest that, well, as John Stuart Mill put it, he who knows only his side of the case knows little of that. That I understand you're well-intentioned, but you seem to be not well-informed on some of the topics that you raise, including some of the academic work, like regulation. Nobel laureate George Stigler won his prize for work on regulatory capture theory, explaining decades ago that, as a rule, regulation is acquired by industry and designed and operated primarily for its benefit. That essentially this notion of government as being for the public benefit has been called into question by a lot of academic work, from that to, for instance, public choice theory, for which James Buchanan won his Nobel Prize, terming it politics without the romance. And yeah, so many of the things that you're stating we call into question. Like we view it as liberals that seem to view people as being selfish and needing the government to step in to protect themselves from each other. And yeah, I know. I guess people will go through a lot of the details. I assume that you're wrong about, like the financial crisis and protecting people. Security rating agencies were government-created oligopolies that never would have survived in the free market. So a large chunk of what happened in the financial crisis was because of bad government regulation that was controlled by industry. Many of the problems that people blame in the free market are actually government problems in disguise if people actually go and look into it, but most people don't have the interest to go and do so.
Sir, I'm going to ask you to, yes, and future questioners, please, much shorter and much louder. So, Gordon, your choice, your chance to respond to this gentleman.
there's a new book out called Democracy in Chains, and it's a description of what they call the Chicago boys, who were part of Milton Friedman's group from the University of Chicago, went to Chile to assist Pinochet, and they applied these free market principles that you were speaking of, and it was Buchanan who you mentioned that was
This book has been well debunked.
Oh, well, and in the event, that's not the only source that has brought out all of the impacts of that experiment in Chile. Whether you use that book or some other source, the country was in almost every measurable impact. It had terrible impact on employment and crime and everything else, and that was, we don't have any country in the world that has ever employed a purely libertarian economic theory as the basis for their government, where they just do without government, and for good reason, and for all the reasons that I've stated in terms of the legitimacy of free market enterprise requires government, in fact, to make businesses operate well. And then I have a quotation from Bill Gates, who's perhaps one of the most successful entrepreneurs, in which he reveres the importance that government played in providing the research for the internet and the kinds of things that he made his own money from. And he goes into a great deal of detail in which he lauds and he expresses gratitude for the research that government did, which then was made available. So it wasn't private enterprise that actually initially was engaged in the
Brian, please, we have a whole list of people, so we'll come back to you.
I would like to express my disagreement with your 40 assumptions. Every time you would list one, you would list off several examples, and we need to spend some time going through and demolishing each of your assumptions. In 1978, Alfred Kahn, at the behest of Jimmy Carter, got rid of the Civil Aeronautics Board. They had regulated airlines, told what prices to charge, told what cities to fly to. Every year since then, airlines have grown safer and more cost-effective. We would expect the same thing as happened with telecom after AT&T boosted its monopoly. For the energy sector, which is now mostly in utilities, which are highly repugnant to free market capitalism. And so there are hundreds of examples that would refute what you're saying. You need to start with the question, where is the coercion in this model? You mentioned labor unions. Ted Kennedy got pissed at the Teamsters for supporting somebody against his brothers, and so he thrashed them by giving them free market opportunity. The labor unions have been rapidly declining for 50 years, and those few that remain are usually in some government-subsidized ghetto. And so what we're looking at is the triumph of free market capitalism, taking the world 1 million to well over 7 billion. And in the last 20 or 30 years, another billion have been thrust into the middle class, mostly by the failure of communism, Eastern Europe, China, and so forth.
And I'm going to ask you to please terminate. Gordon, your response to this gentleman.
Well, I think you have some good points in terms of some of the areas where government and the airline deregulation was one area I would agree with you that has had good outcomes, and like I said, there's some things that government can do better and some things that they can't, and I think that I'm not suggesting that everything that government does is done better than private enterprise, but what I find flawed in libertarianism is they take the position that nothing that government does is worthwhile, as I understand it.
And I would take that position, and I would anywhere the government does it better than free enterprise.
Medicaid.
Again?
Okay.
Go ahead.
We
You
now.
can take another question.
Do you wish to respond to that, Gordon, or are we on to our next questioner?
Well, you can go on to the next question. And
Okay,
I'll
Frank.
respond.
The list is currently Frank, Blake, Scott, Lee, Larry, Ralph, and then Andrew. So please keep your comments short.
Go with two questions. First question is, can government ever be too large? Yes
Sure.
or no?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Well, having answered yes, it can be
Yes,
too large.
of course.
What is the optimum size of government?
I think that the optimum size of government is based on well-informed citizenry looking at making an assessment of both the cost and benefit of regulations and evaluating them in human terms rather than just presuming that either government or private enterprise is better is a better mechanism.
We continue to watch government grow at, I think currently the growth rate is, pick a number, 3% annually.
I don't know.
Do we project it ever leveling off? Leveling out?
I don't know the answer to that either. I'm not saying that the present.
When will we have too much government?
Well, I think one thing you can do is to take a look at other countries and what percent of government participation has contributed to their economy and what kind of government they have. So a lot of people there's a happiness index. Are you familiar with that? Where they try to, ask people subjectively, how do you, what is your life like? How do you feel about the kind of life that you're living? And ask them questions, and then they look into questions about how much crime there is, how much divorce there is, how much mistrust there is, how much corruption there is. And they've gone through all these different countries, and every time these Scandinavian countries almost always end up as the most desirable place to live, which has the highest level of government involvement, and that people really, and there was this period of time historically that economists look at as the golden age, and that was just up to 1980 when everyone's income was increasing as a result of increase in productivity, and it wasn't just the capitalists, people who were investors, and that was considered the golden age, low unemployment in this country, and that's when we had a lot of regulations in order to bring that about, and that people who were poor weren't just left to starve and those kinds of things. So there's so much that government does. About 40% of our economy is in government. So
Thank you.
Okay, we have Blake next.
I have many questions, but I'll just get to one. First of all, I want to thank you for being here.
Yes.
And thank you for challenging our beliefs so that we can better understand what we believe and how we believe it. And also for giving us the opportunity to help you understand that perhaps some of what you're saying, we don't agree. I'm willing to be wrong. I always say I'm willing to be wrong, and I hope you are too. So, I have like 15 questions, and I have to just...
Number 7.
Okay, we'll do number 7. The poor are not to be shamed for being poor. The poor are poor. But we see poor shaming across the nation because the poor are being used as tools for power. Would you care to address that?
I'd like some more coffee, please.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, the poor are being shamed for being poor.
Blake, could you repeat the question
Sure.
loudly?
The poor are currently being shamed for being poor.
Uh-huh.
Shame on you for being poor. You shouldn't be poor. There's opportunity. But the poor are actually, that's what a lot of people say. Not necessarily me, and not libertarians necessarily, but some people, conservative Christians, etc., because they want more money for themselves. But the poor also can be, I hate to use the word greedy, but they will use their votes to help people gain power, and they're being used as a tool for people who want to gain power due to their poor. They're being poor. Would you care to address that?
Well, yeah, I mean, you had Governor Romney, a major reason why people voted against him had to do with his 43% of the people or whatever it was were lazy and just, I mean, that he would just assume that if people are poor, it's because they don't want to work, and they're lazy and those kinds of things. And it just doesn't seem to, I think for most Americans, it just didn't seem to match their own experience with what periods of high unemployment for structural reasons that have nothing to do with individuals being not being moral or having a work ethic or those kinds of things. As far as politicians using poor people for their political advantage, I suppose that's true. I mean, that doesn't mean that it's not something that we should just ignore. I've had this quandary for a long time. What do we do about poor people that don't want to work, assuming there are people like that? My understanding is that in communist countries, they have this theory, to each according to their needs, from each according to their ability, and that means that you help people who need it, even if they don't want to work. And there was one of the reasons for the collapse of communism had to do with a lot of alcoholism and people who were feather bedding. They were pretending to work, and because they would get paid anyway, whether they made any effort and that kind of thing. So what they did was they redefined mental illnesses, so that if a person didn't want to work, they put them in a mental hospital. So at least that was a disincentive for them not to work. But it's a very perplexing problem in a capitalist country, because even welfare recipients today can't get welfare at least theoretically can't get welfare unless they can demonstrate that they've made an effort to get a job. And I haven't, I used to work for legal aid and with poor people, and I really didn't find many people that were poor, because those were the people we represented as lawyers that were just congenitally unwilling to work. And I mean, it just seems so necessary for a person's sense of self-worth, even if they don't make much money at it. And a lot of people are willing to work at terrible jobs rather than starve to take care of their family, if for no other reason than just to take care of themselves and their family. So I don't know, it doesn't bother me that if a politician uses poverty as a talking point to get votes, but if that will make it possible for poor people to have a better life. I personally gave a lot of my money to a charity that will enable children to have access to food. That there are millions of children in this country that are food insecure. They don't know where their next meal is coming from. These children are handicapped from birth merely because they were born to the wrong womb, that their parents happened to not have the resources to feed them. And I thought that was inexcusable in a city as wealthy as Boulder, that we had children that were not being asked nutritious food for no fault of their own. And I don't know of anywhere, I mean, there's no private industry that's going to do anything about that. So it seems like that would be an appropriate role for government to play. Same thing with preschool, that children who don't have preschool are handicapped from their first grade. I don't know how many of you have children, but their brains aren't developing properly because their parents may not be reading to them. They're not getting the kind of educational experience that enable them to succeed in later life. And so it costs everybody, the public, to take care of these people if they're not properly prepared by being able, when they first start school, to take advantage of the free public education that they receive. So those are just a couple of examples.
We have Scott, Lee, Larry, Ralph, Elaine, and then Blake. Anybody else wish to speak? Okay, so it is now Scott.
Well, I would just point a couple things out from my personal life experience. When I went to college in the 70s, I worked during the summer. I paid all the tuition and everything else. It was fairly easy to do. And 1978, 79, they changed the bankruptcy laws, and you couldn't declare bankruptcy on your student debts. The loans went up, and the cost of education just skyrocketed. If you allowed to declare bankruptcy on those debts, it would bring down the cost of education again. The other one is Social Security. Holland had a problem because they didn't have enough money in the Social Security system. So they decided they would create nonprofit pension groups, which cover basically everybody. It works on a market scale. But I would defy anybody to tell you that Social Security, which if you put in the same amount of money that you put in Social Security and a pension fund, you're going to end up getting paid about 80% of your top 10 year salary. About. And but the reality is Social Security doesn't even come close to that. So why not privatize it, let it go out to nonprofits if you don't want to do a company, and move on with that. There are so many things that government does badly, and the mantra from people on the other side seems to be, oh, we'll just correct it, we'll get it bigger, and somehow it'll all be all right. And it never works that way until somebody goes broke, and then a lot of people have to suffer once that happens. So my suggestion is really kind of look at some of the stuff. Even your one that you suggested, the big World Bank giving money, I give money to small micro groups because, you know, honestly, statistically, they do a great job. Once you get it down to the small people who need the money to start businesses, it grows. The economy grows fantastically. Giving it to big banks and big corporations where it can be spent by the government overseas has never worked.
Scott, I'm going to have to
Okay,
cut you off.
that was up.
Go ahead, Gordon.
I would just like to respond just to the Social Security argument you make. The first time that we really had any major effort to privatize Social Security was in the George W. Bush administration, and he was getting some traction there for a while, and I think it was what was it? Anyway, one of the major economists with the New York Times, Craig Krugman, pointed out some of the problems with that, and primarily because of his own input, it seemed to prevent them from privatizing Social Security. Well, guess what happened after the crash of 2007 to 2009? If they had been successful in privatizing Social Security, that money would have just disappeared. I mean, obviously privatizing it, as you suggest, may very well bring about greater returns on the capital, but it also imposes greater risks as well. And had they successfully privatized Social Security, all these people that are receiving it and depending on it for their life would have completely lost everything. So I mean, that's so we could take one by one each of the types of programs that government does and say maybe the government could be done better without it. But that's one case where I think that it would have been a mistake to have privatized Social Security.
They have lost everything.
Stop. Alrighty. We have. Please, there's a list here. We have Lee, Larry, Ralph, Andrew, Heidi, Elaine, Blake, Brian, Lee.
My question is very simple.
Please speak up because the microphone can barely hear you.
My question is very simple. Are your responses written down in an electronic form I could get?
I have an extra copy I can make available. In fact, if anybody else would like one, I would appreciate it if you would take the copy that I have of my responses and make some other copies for anyone else that wants them, because I don't have that many of those copies. But
Do you have a website where it is? I think that was
No,
the question.
I don't.
Any way to go through and edit and respond to each one?
no, like I said, I'll give the one. I have an extra copy that I'll share with one of you, and then you can make copies of it. And
Gordon, since I'm responsible for this group, email me this copy. I will post your copy to the next email, and everybody in this group will receive
Well,
it.
yeah, I could do that, or I could just give it to you, either way.
I
Okay.
prefer getting it in electronic
All right,
form.
sure, that's fine.
Alrighty. Thank you, Lee. Lee, did that address your issue?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, Larry.
Yes. Why are you trying to preserve a broken system? The sole purpose of government is to protect our rights. They have done a miserable job of that. The military's duty is to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. They have done a miserable job of that. So I see no, I'd like you to comment on that.
Well, like I said, I briefly worked for the government as a lawyer with legal services, and I didn't find many people who were poor that for the first time were treated were the words in the Declaration of Independence that we're created equal, and that we have notion of that we have equal opportunity. Those are words that have no meaning if they don't have lawyers to represent people that are screwed over for so many reasons just because they're poor. And I was very inspired by the quality of legal services that we provided to people who had been disadvantaged. In many cases, they were just arbitrarily, well, I can't go into all the kind of abuses that these poor people experienced in my own, in my own life. As far as the idea of government, and that you're telling me that you were pretty unhappy with the way our foreign policy has been conducted. I don't know that you can blame that on libertarianism. In fact, libertarians usually, that's one of the exceptions to libertarianism, that government should be, and that's the only way that we can have a satisfactory defense is for government to take on that role, because otherwise we wouldn't have a defense. I mean,
What's to defend over in Afghanistan? Well, who's violating the Constitution over in Afghanistan? Who's interfering with our constitutional rights in Afghanistan?
I'm not in a position to get into the nitty gritty of what foreign policy we do has been good policy. I mean, I think our engagement in Iraq was a terrible thing to do, but does that mean that we shouldn't have any defense at all? The Constitution essentially was established because we had a lot of different states that had their own independent governments, and there was no common currency, there was no common defense. So we had to form the government in order to protect ourselves from foreign invasions. And that's the only argument I'm making. Whether or not it's been used well or poorly, or in some cases we've gone to war for justifiable causes. Most people would agree that Second World War was a justifiable war. Maybe every war since then hasn't been. Maybe some of the things we have done shouldn't have been done. I don't want to get into the nitty gritty of that, but to suggest we should have no defense whatsoever makes no sense. And to think that if we didn't have government doing it, that private enterprise would step up to the plate and provide defense doesn't seem to me that that's a practical possibility.
I'm not saying private enterprise. It's the responsibility of the people to make sure the government does their job.
Right.
Larry, this is something that could go on for hours and hours and hours. So it is Ralph, Andrew, Heidi, Elaine, Blake, and this gentleman behind you, and then another gentleman behind you. So I have 3 points, and I'm going to try and go through them relatively quickly. In terms of communism, there's a famous line from the people who lived under communism. We pretend to work, and they pretend to pay us.
Right.
It's amazing how history manages to repeat itself. During Roman times, the way the Roman emperor maintained his power was bread and circuses. And yet, that's what we have yet again. We give people free bread, we give them whatever.
Football games.
Okay. And last, you said pure libertarianism doesn't work, and this is the one I'd like you to respond to if you want to. Feel free to respond to all 3, but this is one I really would want. Pure libertarianism doesn't work. It's never been tried in the world. Well, when the American Revolution happened, the English thought there was absolutely no way that 13 colonies spread over much of a continent could possibly work. And surprisingly, it did. The fact that we've never had a pure libertarian society doesn't mean that it doesn't work. What it means is that there are entrenched powers that be who do not wish to see it work. At least that's the way I see it. Gordon, please respond.
Let's see. Your first comment was what again?
We pretend to work, and they pretend to pay us.
Yeah. I just want to make it clear that my position, as you were suggesting, is that we are a mixed economy. I think it is a good thing that we're a mixed economy, and that there are some things that government can do well, and there's some things that government can't do as well as the free enterprise system. So I don't know to what extent that comment was suggesting that I favor socialism, which I don't. I have as many problems with socialism or Marxism as I do with libertarianism, but I do find that the best tools that for running government is a mixed economy, and that is in fact how most governments throughout as far as I know, every government throughout the world is a mixed economy that has a little bit of both. And to disparage government, which is what I see libertarianism is about, is sort of a one-size-fits-all mentality that says that only libertarianism or that private enterprise without government can somehow be the best form of government.
Okay. Well, you stopped exactly the wrong time. I believe your name's Andrew?
Yeah, man.
Okay.
All right.
So let's go.
Thanks
Andrew.
so much for coming. I appreciate it. I would recommend if you really want to tear some holes in libertarianism, there's a professor here in town, and he is an anarcho-capitalist, and I saw him debate some libertarian. It sounds like, and he's more of a Randian, and he really, he
What's
probably
his name?
is a good place. I can't, I'm
Is
drawing a
it
blank on it.
CU?
Yeah,
Is it
it's
Schumer? Professor
Yeah,
Schumer?
I think it might be Humor.
He's talked to us before.
Has he? Okay.
Oh, I know
He's an
humor.
anarchist,
I know
right?
humor.
Yeah, he's an anarcho-capitalist.
He's in the
So
philosophy.
That's kind of how you're
He's in the
characterizing
philosophy
Michael
part.
Humor.
some of libertarianism.
Right.
It's, he's as far as infrastructure and defense and things. So
I've had
just wanna say that, but you
conversations
mentioned
with
the crisis a few times, and we had bailouts starting in the 80s and 97. We bailed out long-term capital management, so it's not a new thing. And we could have listened to Ron Paul in 03, 04 telling us exactly what was going to happen. You can go back and listen to those. We were in a housing bubble, he called it. But my question is about intergenerational inequity. How much debt is too much debt to pass on to the next generation when a lot of it's just wasteful? I'm not an anarcho-capitalist. I believe the government should be able to take some resources from the people under everyone's kind of vote, or, I don't think we're a democracy or a republic. We have enumerated powers. Democracy is basically two wolves and a sheep deciding what's for dinner, and republic is a well-armed sheep. That's why the founding fathers knew that. So I just want to say, how much wasteful spending can we keep piling on? We got a debt ceiling debate coming up here, and Trump's already been yapping about how he's going to use it as a bargaining chip. how much is 99 trillion too much to pass on to the next generation with nothing to show for it?
Well, the question of how much debt we have is
We're talking about unfunded liabilities as well, and
Yeah.
among the states and the cities and the counties, the deep state, quote unquote, that's even way bigger. So I'm just curious if you have any qualms about your great grandkids inheriting $43,000 in debt the day they're born. So money, I get that, but
yeah. Well, I mean the aspect of how much debt is dangerous for our society.
well, I mean inequality, just a
Inequality.
moral question. There's a lot of economic stuff. I thought about asking a question about how gay men can't donate blood, and that's the government persecuting gay rights, and then supposedly the Democrats of that party, they addressed gay people as queers in the 70s, 80s. Things change over time. I'm just wondering if you have any moral qualms about passing on so much debt to your grandkids, if you have kids, if you don't. Not
Well, my answer to that is yes. I do have qualms about having too much debt, and I think that there is indeed an incentive for politicians to spend money in order to get votes, and so that means that there's an incentive to grow debts. I'm certainly not in favor of that. I think that some of the problems with inequality that you bring up need not be fixed by adding to the debt. It's just a matter of re-examining our tax system so that we can have adequate taxes that will address inequality. And my own beliefs about taxation, about a fair tax system, is that it seems appropriate that people are taxed in accordance with proportionate with their discretionary income. So to tax people that aren't making enough money from their work to be able to support themselves makes no sense. I mean, in fact, we presently have some negative income tax where people who are just making enough to survive actually get taxes back, and then we have a progressive tax system otherwise, where people who have the most discretionary income, that is above what's necessary for their housing, their clothing, their food, and taking care of their family, as that increases, that it seems reasonable that they're in the best position to afford to pay taxes. And so having the wealthiest people pay a higher percent of their income as taxes, to me, makes sense. And the argument about reducing taxes increases the amount of economic activity is a false assertion. I mean, there's plenty of evidence to the contrary that just simply is not true. And
what you're talking about inequality,
We have a lot more questions coming, so I'm going to cut you off. I apologize, Andrew.
please.
Andrew, the other Andrew, could I ask you to please stand because you're hidden behind a camera?
Okay. Wow, there's so much to get to, and so I guess I'll hang out till the end in case anyone wants to chat with me further. But in the brief time that you want us to speak, I would just say that I'm noticing. I want to try and cut to the chase, because I noticed that in this argument about libertarian economics versus progressive economics, both sides have their expert economists. Both sides have their Pulitzer Prize winners they can point to. Both sides have their official studies they can point to. And so someone like me, it's like, okay, well, who do I believe? How do I decide who's right and who's wrong here? So I think I've found two ways to do that. One is looking at my own personal experiences, my own life story, and where I am, where I've gotten to, and also looking at those aspects of history that are irrefutable and accepted by all sides. Because a lot of what I've noticed is people have a habit, no matter what their political views, of rewriting history to suit whatever their current ideological narrative is. And everybody can always say, history's on my side. No, the opposite person says, no, history's on my side. Well, you know, how I look at the irrefutable facts of history. And one of those is when you look at the Great Depression, World War II, the New Deal, and the enormous economic boom that happened after the growth the world had ever seen right here in the U.S. You look at the Scandinavian countries, how well they've been doing the last 30, 40 years, and these are things that are irrefutable. And I know libertarians like to say that, well, World War II and other factors helped the economy grow so greatly in the 40s, 50s, 60s, in spite of the New Deal. Well, to that, there's two words that debunk that argument, as far as I'm concerned, and those two words are great compression. This was deliberate government policy that could not have happened by World War II alone, or the mess in Europe strengthening U.S. Economy, on its own. If you look up great compression, that shows how government action helped make that economic boom. And there's also my own.
I got to cut you off. I
Great.
apologize.
If anyone would like me to share how my personal story I feel debunks libertarian arguments, I'd be happy to share that when we're done. Thank you.
Gordon, if you wish to respond or agree with Andrew number 2.
I think, Andrew, you got to the very heart of where I'm coming from in terms of my perspective about libertarianism, and that is libertarianism in terms of its most fundamental aspect of how it's defined seems to me to have an ultimate trust in the invisible hand of the market. I equate it to fundamentalist beliefs in the Bible, that libertarians have that same kind of worship of the invisible hand of the market, so that our values are best determined not by people citizens, we the people, making choices about what makes for a better society, but by leaving it up to the unfettered market itself. And so if we want something, consider something of value, we spend dollars on it, and so our dollars become our votes for this or that public policy. And so according to that idea, we probably wouldn't have any arts, because the arts are not self-supporting. I mean, the ticket sales are not sufficient for the opera or the symphony or any of the arts. None of them that I know of in this community can support themselves on the basis of ticket sales alone. And that we could just say, well, nothing is worthwhile unless the market supports it. It's a one-size-fits-all, like I said, idea that our values cannot be gauged by human conscience, and that seems to me the essence of what is problematic about libertarianism, is it puts too much stock in letting the market itself dictate our values, rather than bringing our own values to the market. So your point about life experience is as a basis for making economic, political, and moral policies, than leaving it up to an ideology like libertarianism.
Gordon, I'm going to stop the recording for technical reasons. We have started the recording again. Yes, and please, if you have
donations, anybody else that wants to donate this, I'm going to go by the bank and throw this into the bank account for the Boulder County Libertarian.
Yes, and the cost of your meal, even though you didn't order coffee, will be picked up by us. So
thank you.
I apologize. I should have told you that earlier, so you could have chowed down.
I'll order a lot now.
Okay. Heidi, I'm going to ask you to please speak up.
I think I heard you refer to libertarianism as a one-size-fits-all kind of ideology. I see a lot more one-size-fits-all solutions coming from big centralized states like Obamacare, one size fits all. Common Core curriculum,
I'm sorry, what was the second one?
Common Core curriculum for schools, one size fits all. And by contrast, look around in an average supermarket to see the incredible variety that the marketplace gives us. You know, if government were running the grocery stores, I don't think you'd find 50 different types of bread to choose from. And in your opening remarks, it seems like you were conflating government with society a lot. You were talking as if government didn't provide a safety net, there would be no safety net. And that simply isn't true, and it sure wasn't true in the 1900s when there were mutual aid societies and lots of vibrant private charities, and everything that needed to be done was done. There were physicians providing pro bono help to the indigent. And, you know, in society, that's peaceful and voluntary. And when government does it, it's by force. They can't give anything to anybody without taking from somebody else forcibly. And I think solutions are a lot better coming from the peaceful private sector, and private charities are a lot better at discriminating between the people that need a helping hand and the people that need a kick in the butt. Government doesn't discriminate. They just say, if you earn less than this, you're entitled to this, you know. There's no discrimination there.
Gordon.
Well put.
I've had a lot of experience with charities. I've given a lot of money to different charities. I was diagnosed with cancer, and I didn't know how long I had to live, so I gave a lot of money to different charities. And I thought I would do it before I died. I really know. And I found that many of these charities are top heavy. That is, that they're a major reason to support their staff. Some of them invest very poorly. Some of them didn't spend the money the way they promised they would. Had I died, I wouldn't have known that. So I think there's a lot of room for looking at these not-for-profit charities and having better tools for evaluating what they do. Some of them have such great reputations that people don't really look into the nitty-gritty of you know, how they're doing business. As far as the particulars of Obamacare, I know the history behind that when Hillary Clinton originally was trying to get something passed in the way of making it possible for everyone to have access to health care, there was a book written by David Groder and Haynes Johnson, who were journalists, investigative journalists, who said that it was behind the scenes that they were meeting with Gingrich, and they said that that the Republicans couldn't afford to have any kind of health care passed because it would undermine the Republican Party for generations to come, because it would be, you know, if they made that available, it would be so appealing that it would be very difficult for the Republicans to deal with that. And so they've had this long-term agenda of making sure that nothing that the Democrats did could be passed, and were unwilling to even speak to the Democrats about fixing the things that need to be fixed about Obamacare, that both Democrats and Republicans recognize to be problematic, including the what do they call it, those compulsive payments that they had. And it was essentially a program that was the same as Romney came up with. I think the idea that the Libertarians are more, embrace more freedom than Democrats, that overlooks the fact that in the absence of regulations, businesses were very content to have child labor, for example, and we look upon that today as inexcusable, that children 10, 15 years are put into the workforce and not able to develop fully as children. And then there was this case called Lochner, which was a case where they were challenging a limited number of hours for workers where bakers could not work more than 10 hours, and the Supreme Court said that that was a violation of the freedom of contract. Well, that seems to me that that would be very much in keeping with the libertarian idea that people should be able to contract for whatever they want to contract. If that's, if they're willing to spend 15, 20 hours working, then that's their business. But that case, Lochner's probably been the most condemned cases in legal history that I'm aware of, just because it was so obtuse and not recognizing that there needs to be some measure of human conscience in terms of how much we're willing to have government intercede to ensure a certain sense of fairness in the market. And so we have laws against discrimination that wouldn't exist in the absence. I mean, if libertarians were running the government, where people are not able to get a home or a job because of their race or their ethnicity, and those things. Yeah.
Whoa. Yes. Okay. What we have, it's Elaine, Blake, the two gentlemen behind there, Lee, Ralph, and then Mike. So let me transit. And Elaine, you're up.
Actually, mine were just little nitty points I'd rather pass and listen. That is how I'd rather do it.
All right. So we're on to Blake.
Okay. First of all, thank you for working with people who can't afford lawyers. I think that's awesome.
Yeah, I was going to thank you for all your donations to the dairy.
Right. You're doing it on a voluntary basis to equalize those people who can't afford lawyers. And I think that is very laudable. I want to make 2 comments and then 3 questions. The 3 questions are related, and they'll be quick. First of all, I owned and operated a preschool for 10 years.
Operated what?
A preschool.
Preschool.
You mentioned preschools. The government should
Right.
be involved in preschools.
Sure.
Preschools are there for socialization. There's many ways children can get socialization skills. It doesn't have to be in a government-operated school. Okay.
Blake, please speak up.
Oh, I'm sorry. Usually people tell me to be quiet. So I will.
What do you mean by socialization? Teaching kids to be social or teaching them to be socialists?
No, teaching children to interact with one another on a cooperative basis. That's what I mean by
Okay, if it's
socialization.
run by government, it's also going to teach them to be socialists, isn't it?
Perhaps, but let's not go there. The economy has changed so much since the 80s when I ran my preschool that there are very few work-at-home mothers anymore. So it's hard for mothers to be able to afford to take their kids to preschool.
Right.
So why did that happen? Now I won't go there. That's a what do you call it?
Rhetorical?
Rhetorical question. Thank you. You're helping me out a lot today. So the second comment was, during the revolution you said there was no common currency, and I reject that premise. The common currency was gold.
Was what?
Gold.
Uh-huh.
And that backed everything. Gold and silver. Thank you. Again. The 3 questions are related. Who creates jobs? Do taxes incentivize or disincentivize job creation? And was Shakespeare funded by taxes? Please comment.
Was Shakespeare?
So they're all related. Who creates jobs? Do taxes incentivize or disincentivize? And was Shakespeare funded by taxes?
His performance art.
Yes.
Well, sure, taxes incentivize. I think they can quite
Gordon,
all.
could I ask you to pull the microphone closer to you?
Yeah, I think that.
Just pull it closer to you.
Sure.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Yes, I think taxes do incentivize. The question is, what do they incentivize, and in terms of their being well, since preschool is your experience, like I said, one of the things that that people don't, I don't know to what extent. Yeah, the history of public education is very interesting. That that it was not that long ago that they began to make free public education available to everyone, and that had a significant influence on America having a very capable workforce. As people who had the skills, learned the skills to be able to have productive life, and what is surprising to me is that with the new information that we have from the social scientists about how important it is for young people to be read to at an early age, to have access to education at an early age, and to be adequately fed with nutritious food, that those kids, that we just simply allow them to be handicapped for life because they happen to be born to the wrong womb, is one of those areas where, in terms of incentivizing, I think that it's almost criminal that children are disadvantaged because they don't have access to preschool and don't have access to adequate food to develop their minds and their bodies in a way that enable them to be productive citizens. I mean, I just related to that particular issue because that sounds like what your background is.
All right. The next person up is Blake. We just did you, right? Okay. So we have the two gentlemen behind you. You're first. And please speak up. So
you repeat the stereotype that libertarians are, whereas many libertarians are libertarians because they care about other people and they genuinely believe that society will be better and that people will be helped. They are using our methods. In fact, we look at things like you were talking about poor kids that weren't getting enough help, so you need to deal with them charitably. And we view that as one example of government failure. That obviously society now trusts government to help people, whether they should or not. And we see all the ways that it fails them. And we see things like the government actually spends 5 times as much on the poor as it would take to simply give everybody a check to bring them above the poverty line. There's a massive amount of waste there, which is why many libertarians wouldn't agree, but some libertarians push for the idea of a negative income tax, as Milton Friedman suggested, or a basic income. So again, many don't agree with that, but libertarians are concerned about these issues. Many just seek better ways to solve them privately. In terms of personal experience, obviously that's something to consider, but in many ways it parallels the pre-scientific world where people relied on anecdotes and so forth, and that science sort of took over from that and realized that you need to look at data, and even though it's difficult, as you said, ideology can make it hard to decide what economists to trust or whatever. It is a complicated realm, but it's something to try to focus on. Libertarians tend to seem to make analogy to creationism, whereas we view us as being more akin to the folks that believe in evolution. Let's see.
Could I ask you to wrap up, Brian?
I was just trying to see because there were a bunch of things that we would consider myths in terms of the data you mentioned, like since the 80s, part of what's happened is that regulation has gone up, not down, in terms of the economy being bad, and in terms of the growth in the 1800s and whatever. There may have been protectionism, but overall it was far less regulation. That things might have been even better if they weren't protectionist. You need to consider counterfactuals. I guess
I'm going to ask you to stop. Please go ahead and respond.
I think I'll pass.
Okay, so
there are 3 justifications for capitalism. The first is that it is inevitable. No matter what you do, people will look out for their own best interest. Second, that it is practical. People will work harder if you give them incentives. The third is that it is moral. All 3 are obviously true and correct. In terms of pure anarcho-capitalism, Carol Quigley commented after 900 AD, the state had completely evaporated. That laid the groundwork for Western European liberalism. We would now call that libertarianism. And it put Western Europe at the forefront of human development. So you might consider the examples. There are also many sliding scales. Was Hong Kong a more interesting place than Moscow under the Soviet Union? Obviously, yes. Is China doing better now than when Maoism absolutely suppressed self-interest? Again, yes. There are thousands of examples that prove that history is on the side of liberty. There are two people in here who have not said anything that I agreed with. You're one of them, and Arthur too. Andrew too is the other. I would in general endorse anything Heidi says because she gets it right.
All right, do you wish to respond to that, Gordon?
Yes, the morality is really a measure of values and how we arrive at what's good and bad. That's what we refer to as morality. And so morality for over 1,000 years, from the 4th century until the 17th century, was primarily a product of the Catholic Church. That much of the emphasis was on looking to sacred sources, and the people from Greece and Rome was discouraged. And one of because I wanted to keep this brief, I didn't go into the fact that you're right, that people's lives improved immensely after capitalism came into effect, and people began to innovate and be resourceful and take advantage of the markets as a tool for enabling people to lift up themselves by opening business and risk their capital and that sort of thing. The Great and the Gilded Age, when so much wealth was concentrated in the hands of a few, and that a lot of the people that needed the money to spend in order to create a vibrant economy didn't have that money, the money to make that happen. And that's where Keynesian economics came into effect, to recognize that it was necessary to do some government pumping of the prime in order to make things happen. Well,
are you referring to 1890 to 1910, the Gilded Age, that time frame?
The time right before 1929.
Well,
up to
we
1929.
were growing about 10%
Please
a year.
speak up, Ken.
We were growing about 10% a year from 1890 to 1910. Income tax, when they imposed the central banking Federal Reserve, and a bunch of progressive lies came in. That means progressive Bolshevism. They said we'll have to adopt it slower here than the Soviet experiment, but they were absolutely communist, and they've been fighting with the free market people ever since, and everything they've touched is bad.
Okay, and so you would dismiss the quality of life the Scandinavians have, where there's a very high level of government.
I would say they would do far better with less government. They've had some flip-flops on total socialism, and they've always bounded forward. When you get 106% taxation levels, it's somewhat out of control.
We have Lee, Ralph, Mike, and that gentleman again. So it is Lee, you're up.
A quick comment on the Scandinavian example. Scandinavia's high standard of living essentially was due to a high economic ramp rate that occurred essentially before 1950, and then after 1950 is when they adopted the highly socialistic model. And since 1950, their growth rate has not been very good. So in a sense, they're coasting on what they were able to achieve in the first half of the 20th century, and then had a philosophy, a political change that it has, and since then it has not been very dramatic. The only point I wanted to make is this difference between the morality versus economics. I look at libertarianism as a moral philosophy rather than an economic philosophy. And the moral part of it is very, very simple. What you may have run across this in your work, which is the non-aggression principle. A libertarian renounces the use of aggression in human conduct. Aggression is defined as the first use of force or fraud. Period.
Okay, Gordon, respond to the fundamental libertarian principle of non-aggression.
I don't know that I have any quarrel with that. Seems
Then I'll jump in for Lee.
How about taxation?
What was your first point? I did have a response to that.
The growth rate of the Scandinavian.
Oh yeah, the Scandinavian. Yeah, the Scandinavian countries for several years, according to this happiness index, has been, well at the top of the list. But I've seen comparisons between the way Finland and the U.S. responded to the economic collapse that took place in 2007 and 2009. For a while, they were kind of at a loss as to what to do, and they ended up, people like Alan Greenspan, who was a real Ayn Rand follower. He finally acknowledged that the government did have a responsibility before the crash to do something to curb some of the excesses of the mortgage bankers and some of those other deceits that were taking place within the marketplace, and essentially renounced his commitment to libertarianism. But anyway, I've heard the discussion about Finland versus United States response, and that is, in Finland, they came through the recession pretty well because they had in place programs to retrain workers and an adequate safety net so that there wasn't as much many people having to go bankrupt and losing their homes and all of that sort of thing. And that's, to me, that was a sign that government can play a role in preventing problems of those kind of extreme numbers of bankruptcy in a more effective way than just leaving it up to the market.
Am I allowed to follow up?
Yeah.
But quickly.
We look for the root cause of that. We look for the root cause of such things as recessions, and doing the Band-Aid of, safety net and stopgap temporary measures. That's not the root cause. The root cause is I use the word counterfeiting, because that's what the Federal Reserve does.
Right.
If you read Hayek and you read von Mises and Murray Rothbard, you can find the exact mechanism for how the inflation, meaning the creation of money out of thin air, destabilizes the economy and is responsible for this oscillation that we call the business cycle. 2007, that was a bad one. The Great Depression, that was a bad one. But it is an oscillation that is root cause indiscriminate inflation of the currency.
Yeah, I don't know that monetary policy, the complaints you're speaking of on monetary policy, that really is necessarily relevant to the question about libertarianism or not. I think either way, I think libertarians or people who weren't libertarians would have the same concerns that you're speaking of about creating too much debt or printing too much money. That to me is this whole different issue than whether we have a libertarian economic program or something else. This Ha-Chu Chang mentions that there are, I think, 9 different significant economic theories, and thinks and believes that each of them have something to contribute to a viable economy. He speaks of classic economics, neoclassic, Keynesian, institutional, developmental, behavioral, and so forth. But to pin foreign policy complaints that you're raising having something to do with libertarianism, I'm not sure I understand the connection.
All right. It's Ralph, Mike, and then that gentleman behind you. So Ralph's turn. I've seen surveys on happiest place on earth.
Uh-huh.
And as far as I can remember, the happiest place on earth was Nepal. And that's a place where people live in filth and you don't have very good health care. But I'll raise something even more fundamental. Fundamental economics says you cannot compare individual utility, where the word utility is a substitute or a synonym for the word happiness. There's just no way to do it. So these surveys on human happiness are suspect from, at least from my point of view, from the outset. Please comment.
Well, I think that I think it would seem to me to be legitimate to look at two different countries and ask questions about which of these two countries has the greatest amount of, you call it filth, and the other one has a very clean environment. Another one has very high crime rates. Another one doesn't. Another one has high rates of distrust among its people. Another one has an economy that where people can turn their business over to someone without having to continually suspect them of cheating. I think that the idea that comes out of The Wealth of Nations of Adam Smith's, a lot of libertarians have read into that people are selfish by nature, and that it's best to leave things to the market because bureaucrats take on the role of being paternalistic and taking things from the poor and giving it to the rich. I think there's an underlying fear, particularly among the revolutionaries when they were talking about forming a government, that if they gave too much power to the masses, that they would just simply use that power to take money from the rich. Why they have so many built-in safeguards, three different branches of government. We don't have direct election of people and that sort of thing, and so they were very guarded against this selfishness that they were concerned about, and look back to the collapse of democracy in Greece, and saw that was one of the contributing factors. So anyway, that's, maybe I'm looking through as you say, each of us is biased by our own life experience, and as I look at libertarianism, to me, it presupposes that we can't do anything about inequities that exist due to no fault of the people who are victims of inequity, and that therefore we just leave it to the markets, and therefore, and that is, I've forgotten the woman who left, but she was saying that the charities can take up the slack where government fails to attend to some of those inequities, and I think that a good example where that did not occur was in Bill Gates' case himself. I don't know if you remember, but he was deposed in a litigation against Microsoft for creating a situation where other technology companies could not compete with Microsoft because they had certain difficulty with some of the hardware with the software and being able to. That was Netflix. No, it was. I'm sorry, I can't think of the name of it. Anyway,
it was Microsoft's Explorer, and the judge did some very simple things, and I believe he ruled against Microsoft.
He did rule against Microsoft. So anyway, I think Gates had a come to Jesus moment, and he decided that he was going to see if he could do good in the world, and he went to Africa, and he was surprised himself to find that there were many people in Africa that were dying of diseases that for which there were cures, the cures, that the market didn't work to enable those people to be able to purchase some of these medications, and so that was kind of a wake-up time for his eyes that markets don't always work very well, and that even people whose life was at stake, that they would, there wasn't a mechanism to ensure that there was that they could afford these medicines. So he, a lot of his work since then has been done in Africa and places to try to attend to areas where the market itself doesn't work.
We have the gentleman behind you. Is there anybody else who wishes to speak? We're coming up on close to 2 hours. It was 2 hours that went far too quickly, Gordon. So it'll be this gentleman, and then I will ask a couple of...
Hey, Val?
Yeah, oh, Mike, you wish to speak as well? You know what? You left, okay? You left? Did you just leave with...
No, that was Ralph.
Okay, and point back, you're up next, and then it'll be...
Can I add a quick thing too? Very quick thing.
Well, you'll be after Brian. Sorry about that, Brian. So let me just get Mike up on the screen, and Mike, you're up.
Gordon, thank you for taking the time and having the courage to spend 2 hours of being on the hot seat. So appreciate that very much. I have an observation, and let me see if that rolls into a question. I think underlying all of this is an issue about what kind of political environment human nature, and specifically our good and bad intention, our morality, our beliefs thrives best in. I think that's kind of underlying in all of this. I have my own experience, my own personal observations. The specific observation I want to give based on my experience is that as a libertarian, in believing in non-aggression principles, that we treat each other like adults, that sounds like a pretty good deal. My personal experience is that a government that rules by force of violence is probably less economically valuable and also less capable of providing for everybody's happiness than a lower level of violence. So one of the things I just would like to have you comment on is your suspicions and understandings about how we create the most optimal environment for us humans to thrive.
I'm going to jump in and just say, Mike, thank you so very much. Mike has been the object of government interference in private commerce,
yes,
and suffered enormously from it. So he has firsthand experience at the hand of a heavy-handed government, and so I'm going to ask you, Gordon, to please talk about how government can be controlled so it's no longer heavy-handed.
It's a good question. I think, as opposed to those who maintain that libertarianism is a moral theory, I would say it's a political theory. That's what Ha-Chu Chang suggests, and that the economics economics itself is a political perspective rather than a scientific one or a moral one, and that we have within our capacity as participants in a political system that emphasizes we the people, the capacity to employ reason and science and evidence to bring to the public's attention as best we can where government is out of control in terms of being too heavy-handed and too abusive in terms of overstepping its. It seems that the idea that government has, on occasion been too extended into our regulations than was necessary is something we ought to continue to evaluate. I mean, I don't know if any of you remember this, but Al Gore was supposedly, as vice president, that was his main job was to try to find agencies that could be reduced, and I think he did a substantial job of doing that. That was his main claim to fame as vice president, was to try to.
How much smaller is the government now?
What's that?
How much smaller is the government now? If you had
Well,
so
I think the
much
question is how much smaller was it after Gore did his thing as opposed to before? As far as I don't know the answer to your question about how what the size of government is now as opposed to what it was 20 years ago. But again, I think the question is not how big is the government, but how effective is the government? To what extent are the things that government's doing legitimate and justifiable in the public's interest? One of my former girlfriends from a long time ago was head of the. She was a biostatistician with Johnson & Johnson, and she was head of that department and had her PhD in biotech and was very knowledgeable about the kind of drugs that Johnson & Johnson were producing. It's one of the top 500 companies. I mean, it's a huge company, and even though she was often, like I am here, she was the target where the Federal Drug Administration was finding that they had to go through certain hoops to be able to get drugs on the market that were both safe and effective. She came out. She was very excited. I mean, she was very supportive of those government agencies. She said they have really fine people that work there. They do a good job, and holding her feet to the fire, she respected that. She said they were doing exactly the right thing in the interest of the safety and security. And another area that we didn't talk about, but to me that bothers me, is this the complete deregulation of vitamins and non-pharmaceuticals. That there's 60 Minutes did a really good program on how often these vitamins that they're selling don't even have the contents that they're supposed to have, and they often are making claims that they can do all kinds of miracle things that just aren't true, and there may be, I'm not familiar with whether there've been any major lawsuits for that sort of thing, but here's, in some cases regulations should be even more extensive than they are, and other cases where they maybe are too overblown.
Yeah.
I'm sorry about your personal experience. I would be interested in knowing more about what the government side was in claiming that you had to where you were claiming that they were overstepping their bounds, and clearly that's a human mistake.
Let's do that after we shut down this
sure.
session. Andrew, did you want to? No, not yet. We're going to speak. We're going to let that. I just wanted to know if you wanted to be on the list.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so go ahead.
So in terms of Scandinavian countries, he was saying much of the boom was when they were more free market, and then they added the social programs. And apparently Scandinavian authors have been saying that, well, since then there's been a backlash, that essentially their economy started stagnating, and so they're becoming more free market. So there are a lot of myths about them that I think you actually need to go and look. Sure. A lot of the information is out of date. And in terms of Greenspan, a lot of folks, he may have been an Ayn Rand fan when he was young, but he wasn't really acting as a libertarian when he was running the Fed. And a lot of folks say that his comment didn't make much sense because we blame a lot of the crisis on regulation that was flawed. Back in the 80s, you had things like the savings and loan crisis, which was in part driven by the fact that the government subsidized risk through the federal deposit insurance program, but the government didn't risk weight deposit insurance, and so banks were free to take risks. And libertarians at the time said that if you don't fix this, there's going to be another banking crisis. And they only minimally risk-weighted insurance after that. They didn't privatize it. And so there are lots of ways that the government actually subsidized and allowed risk to happen. So we see the issue as being more complicated. In terms of the internet, that's an area that I've been in. I did the first company in '93 to do commerce over the web, and I've been on the net since 1980. And to say that the government had any role in that is essentially not examining the fact that the government just it's a big customer, and so it happened to fund certain research, but that would have been done privately anyway. Xerox PARC did privately a lot of the development of Ethernet and the networking technologies, and it just happened that the government did fund a few simple protocols, but those would have been done privately. They were competing options. So if the government hadn't been there, the internet would have developed. In fact, a lot of folks said the government sort of stood in the way of the internet taking off because they were the big customer, and so we had the internet was the biggest cluster of computer networks.
Okay,
and
Brian.
Just when the government got out of the way, it went from 3 million to 3 billion.
Okay. So, Gordon?
Okay, I'll read this. This is from another source that disagrees with you, that Bill Gates says that the innovation is the reason our lives have improved over the last century by making the world better. Major innovations are the result of both government investment in basic research and the private sector creativity and investments that turn them into transformative products. Quote, I've heard some people argue that life-changing innovations come exclusively from the private sector, but innovation starts with government support for the research labs and universities working on new insights that entrepreneurs can turn into companies that change the world. The public investments unlock the private sector's ingenuity. The twin miracles of the microchip revolution and the internet were made possible by the U.S. government research, computers accessible and affordable. That is why most of the leading hardware and software companies are based in the U.S. Accelerating innovation requires political leadership and private sector leadership. What made the moonshot possible was the transformation of political rhetoric into breakthrough. It requires a clear, measurable objective that captures the imagination of the nation and fundamentally changes how we view what is possible. It requires marshaling the resources and intellect of both the public and private sectors. When we do that, we chart a course for a future that is safer, healthier, and stronger. This collaboration can create a better community, nation, and world by 1, providing everyone on Earth with affordable energy without contributing to climate change. 2, give every student and teacher new tools so all students get a world-class education. 3, protect the world from future health epidemics. And 4, develop a vaccine for HIV and a cure for neurodegenerative diseases. Private enterprise alone cannot accomplish those goals because they do not meet the goal of maximizing profit in the short run.
I'm going to jump in before Andrew.
Yeah.
And just say, boy, that was a lot of stuff you just went through. Andrew, I'm going to ask you to make your comments quickly, very quickly, and then I will wrap up. You've lost much of your audience here, but it's amazing how long you held on to them, Gordon. So Andrew, please, and don't stand up. You're on the screen.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to comment on, when I looked at the meetup page, I noticed an interesting thing at the bottom of it for this event about persuasion. And it made an interesting argument that a lot of people who their opinions are guided by emotions. It said that liberals are guided by guilt, and conservatives are guided by fear, and libertarians are the ones who are just being logical and reasonable and, just facts, And what's interesting is that as someone who has studied persuasion gurus on all sides for years, that's the same argument they all make too. Liberals say that they're the ones basing stuff on facts, and conservatives are guided by emotion. You have to feel in their emotions. Conservatives say we're the ones with the facts. Liberals persuade them you have to feel in their emotions. Everybody always says the other guys who disagree with them are just being emotional. So that's kind of universal on all sides. And so I would think, okay, well, is there an emotional aspect to a person forming a libertarian view as well? And I'm thinking, okay, let's say I'm fairly wealthy. I make six figures. Let's say I make $100,000 a year, as I'm sure some of this room probably do or have. And let's say the government takes away 30% of it in taxes. That might make me feel angry. Well, anger is an emotion. So some people, I would ask people to be self-aware enough to think, hey, maybe my desire for more money and anger at having less than I thought I was going to have is biasing me towards a certain viewpoint, and maybe my emotions are an aspect here and what's going on. And personally, all I can say is, as someone who's never made even close to $100K a year, if I made $100K a year in the government and I didn't pay $30,000 in taxes, first off, what I'd be left with would be twice as much as I would need to live a very satisfying life. And I look at that $30K not as theft, but as my dues for being a citizen in this great country to help this country grow and help people less fortunate than me prosper.
And I'm going to ask you.
Thank you.
Okay. And go ahead.
No, but just want to say that Jonathan Haidt studied the people see their need for cognition and so forth, and they do say libertarians are more reason-oriented than other groups. There are studies
however that's measured. Okay, we are now coming up on 2.5 hours, Gordon, and I want to say, first of all, you managed to keep the majority of the people here, which is amazing. So I think Gordon deserves just a huge round of applause. My next comment is, this has been a survey of libertarianism, and I would like you to come back and focus on one aspect of libertarianism. We can discuss this by email. Are you willing to do so?
I would prefer not to be the next speaker.
No. We're talking about months from now.
Yeah, sure, I'll come back.
Okay, great. And I'm going to wrap this up by, I'm sorry, you wanted to speak again?
There was a brief comment that I was just going to say.
Make it brief.
Then I was just going to say on the internet that, again, the internet is this huge, massive stuff, and it's only a tiny little piece that the government had much connection to. And again, it could have been funded privately. 2/3 of research funding is private, and if the government weren't funding things, more of it.
Which is a statement of belief rather than a fact, but that's okay.
Terrence Keeley has done academic work.
Okay.
There's a lot of support for this.
So I'm going to wrap up by saying thank you so much, Gordon, and talk about what I'm going to talk about is that when I was running for governor back in 2000, there was a young man who was running against me, whose position was that a minimum wage was a valuable thing. It took me a while for me to get through to him that the minimum wage was a terrible idea. And I will give you one example. I was arguing with him as to whether people should be, and oh my God, allowed to work for $1 an hour. And I said, of course they should be allowed to work for $1 an hour. In point of fact, and this is one way libertarians sometimes argue about things, by arguing from extremes. I believe people should be allowed to have negative wages in order to work for somebody. Why? Because it may be more valuable to them to work for a negative wage for the sheer training of it all. If we, or the government, mandates a certain rule, there's going to be a collection of people who are going to be affected by that rule very, very negatively. No matter what rule it is, I think we can all agree, give me a rule and I will show you people who are going to be negatively affected. Give me a minimum wage and I'm going to show you a whole bunch of people who can't get their foot in the door. I'll show you a whole bunch of people who can't get the training that they want to get. So, I will leave you with that. If you wish to respond to that, great. Otherwise, I will say thank you so much, Gordon. Do you wish to respond to that?
Well,
and please speak up, you're barely registered.
Yeah. Any public policy decision like minimum wage is, I think, best judged not by you or me, but by a general sense of the public that there's certain things that we cannot tolerate. It is repulsive to us, and I guess you could say in an emotional sense that there's no reason, for example, that people shouldn't be able to have sex with animals. That we have laws against bestiality because there's a general sense of repugnance that it undermines the human dignity, and to permit those kinds of things from happening, even though it doesn't hurt you or me, that they should be spending their time screwing sheep or whatever. But so too is the idea of child labor. I mean, in keeping with what you just said, there's no reason that children shouldn't be able to work if they're willing to work, and that presupposes that children have the same mental capacity to know its impact on their lives. And so much of our and theft and assault and battery, but then we get into areas like fraud, and it was Greenspan who specifically said that he didn't believe there should be laws against fraud, because markets, if you cheat someone and the word gets around that you're cheating someone, they're not going to do business with you. And so that's the best response to people who engage in deceit. And but our public is, we made a choice that we are in fact have laws against fraud, that you can sue people that they've defrauded you by using deceit, and there are even criminal laws against fraud. But within the context of libertarianism, it makes sense that you would say, no, just let the market take care of it. So I'm trying to respond to your comment about if a person, they should be allowed to do so. That may work for that individual, but you have to think in terms of the context of, as a society, do we want to let markets essentially take advantage of the power relationship between the employers and the employees, where all these employers are competing for employees that will work for the least amount possible. And the result of that is that we've seen this increase in productivity since the 1980s that for the first time is not being reflected in the income of wage earners anymore. And so much of that increase has gone to the very wealthy and people who have investments in capital, because they're benefiting from the fact that they not only from their products, but by the fact that the wages are flatlining. And so as the productivity, even as the employees are getting more productivity out of each hour of work, they're not reaping the benefits of it. And that's something where government could do something about if we had a political mind to do so. And I would be one person to advocate for that. So, we can have a lot of disagreements about what kind of things the government should be involved in, but one of those things that strikes me as an appropriate role for government is to have a sense of what our emotional conscience tells us about what's fair and what's not fair. And one of those things that to me is not fair is that children who were born to the wrong mother is having to live as a poor person and handicapped for life because they're unable to compete with other children that have been to preschool and who were fed nutritious food as they were growing up.
Gordon, I want to say thank you. Again, that was really wonderful. I will send you email. I'm going to have you back to focus on one issue in depth, which I will hope will explicate and give example to and life to libertarianism. I know I'm not going to convince you.
I want to try to I want to see if I can break my 2.5-hour record.
Okay. And you will. Thank you, Gordon. And with that, I'm going to turn off the recording. Thank you, Gordon.